A fateful encounter. Officer Ethel Davis had lived in Maple Grove for as long as she could remember, having joined the local police force right out of high school. She knew these streets like the back of her hand, each turn, each house, each street corner holding memories of her years patrolling the area. And yet, as she eased her patrol car down the familiar roads on this quiet afternoon, something felt different, something in the air, in the way the wind brushed through the trees, in the way the light filtered through the clouds. As she turned onto Oak Street, the sharp reflection of her own image in the rearview mirror caught her off guard. The face staring back at her was still that of a woman, but one marked by time. A few more strands of gray streaked through her otherwise dark hair, and the lines around her eyes had deepened over the years. Ethel had never been vain, but she couldn't help but notice how the years seemed to have slowly crept up on her. A quiet sigh escaped her lips as she adjusted her grip on the steering wheel. She'd been thinking a lot lately about time, how quickly it passed, how much of it she'd spent serving as a protector in this peaceful suburban town. And yet, despite the years of service, her life felt oddly incomplete. Her husband, J.N., had passed away several years ago after a long battle with illness, and their son, Michael, had been taken from them far too soon in a tragic accident. The grief, though buried deep, was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. As she passed by the park where she and Michael used to spend hours together, pushing him on the swings, running after him as he played tag, her heart gave a familiar ache. It had been so long since she'd heard his laughter or felt the warmth of his little hand in hers. Now, the park was just a place filled with memories but devoid of life. She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on her job as a police officer. The duties of the day were waiting for her, patrolling the streets, ensuring safety, answering the calls of the citizens she had sworn to protect. But even as she drove down Oak Street, a faint feeling lingered, as though something was pulling at her, something she couldn't quite identify, but she felt it deep inside. Just as she was about to pass the old grocery store, a strange sensation seemed to fill the air, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She turned her eyes to the rearview mirror again, this time looking for something that wasn't quite right. And that's when she saw her. There, at the far end of the parking lot, was a tiny figure. A little girl, no older than 4 or 5, standing alone on the cracked pavement. She was dressed in a faded pink dress that seemed out of place in the warm afternoon sun. Her curly hair, once neatly done, was now slightly disheveled, and her shoes were scuffed as though she had been running around. The little girl was standing motionless, her tiny feet planted on the ground, looking down at the pavement with a distant expression. Ethel's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't common to see a child alone in the middle of the afternoon, especially not in this quiet neighborhood. Every instinct in Ethel's body screamed that something wasn't right. She pulled her patrol car to the side of the lot, her boots clicking against the concrete as she parked the car and stepped out, immediately on alert. Her eyes scanned the area. No other cars were parked nearby. No adults in sight. It was just the little girl, standing there, seemingly lost in her own world. "Hey there, sweetheart," Ethel called out gently, her voice soft but firm as she approached the girl. She didn't want to startle her, but the urgency in her steps was clear. "Are you okay? Where's your mommy?" The little girl didn't respond right away. She simply stood there, her small hands clutching something in front of her, perhaps a toy or a piece of fabric that had long since lost its luster. Ethel crouched down, bringing herself to the girl's eye level, trying to make herself less intimidating. "I'm Officer Davis," Ethel continued. "Can you tell me where your mommy is? Are you lost?" For a long moment, the girl remained silent, staring at Ethel with wide eyes that seemed to hold a deep, unspoken fear. Ethel's heart tightened as she saw the fear in those eyes, the kind of fear that no child should have to carry. And then, with a small tremor in her voice, the girl finally spoke. "Mommy doesn't want me anymore." The words cut through the air, sharp and cold, as if they had been weighing on the child's heart for far longer than she had let on. Ethel's stomach dropped. She didn't know what to say. What could she say? This wasn't just a lost child. This was something else entirely. Ethel's mind raced, but she kept her voice calm, steady. "Sweetheart," she said, reaching out and placing a gentle hand on the girl's small shoulder, "you're not alone. I'm here now, okay? We're going to figure this out." The little girl looked up at Ethel, her lips trembling as if she were holding back tears. She said, "I'm too much. That I make things harder," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethel's heart clenched at the sound of the child's broken words. No one, especially not a child this young, should ever feel like they were too much, like they were an inconvenience. But here was this little girl, standing in front of her, a victim of something far darker than Ethel could have anticipated. This wasn't just abandonment, this was emotional neglect, perhaps even worse. "Who's your mommy, sweetheart?" Ethel asked softly, her words almost more of a plea than a question. The girl hesitated, her eyes lowering to the ground. "Her name is Lauren," she said, her voice small and hesitant. Ethel nodded, even though she was uncertain of what to do next. "Okay, Scarlett. I'm going to help you, I promise. Let's get you out of here and find your mommy, all right?" But the girl shook her head, her tiny hand gripping Ethel's firmly as if she were afraid to let go. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to go back. I don't want her to say those things again." Ethel's heart sank. This wasn't just a matter of finding the child's mother. There was something deeper at play here, something painful and complicated. Scarlett, this little girl, was carrying a burden too heavy for someone so young. Without thinking, Ethel scooped Scarlett up into her arms, holding her close. The child didn't resist, but clung to Ethel with a desperation that made Ethel's heart ache. As she walked toward the patrol car, Ethel knew that her shift was about to change in ways she couldn't have imagined. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: whatever secret Scarlett held, Ethel was determined to uncover them. And she wasn't going to let the little girl face them alone, the hidden truths. Ethel Davis's thoughts were consumed by the weight of the moment. As she drove with Scarlett in the passenger seat, her mind was racing. How could anyone leave a child alone like that? The words the little girl had spoken echoed in her ears: "Mommy doesn't want me anymore." They were simple, but they cut through Ethel's heart like a knife. She glanced at Scarlett, who was quietly sitting in the seat beside her, her little hands clasped tightly in her lap. The girl's eyes were wide with confusion, and every so often, Ethel would catch a glimpse of the sadness hidden behind the child's glassy stare. It was as if the world she knew had shattered in an instant, leaving her lost and unsure. And yet, there was a strength there, too, a silent resilience that Ethel couldn't help but admire. Ethel's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she made her way to the police station. She was no stranger to the harsh realities of life. She had seen her fair share of troubled families, broken homes, and situations where children were caught in the middle. But this felt different. Scarlett's words and the look in her eyes told a story that went beyond neglect. There was something more lurking beneath the surface, something that Ethel had yet to understand. When they reached the station, Ethel led Scarlett through the side entrance, avoiding the bustling lobby where the station's officers and civilians were coming and going. She didn't want to overwhelm the little girl. As they walked through the quiet hallway toward the back office, Ethel's mind churned. She had to find out more about Scarlett's situation. Who was this woman, Lauren, who had let her daughter walk into a parking lot all alone? Why had she made her child feel unwanted? The small room they entered was quiet, its white walls adorned with a few framed photographs of the station's staff at various events over the years. There was a round table in the center of the room, and Ethel led Scarlett to a chair, gently guiding her to sit. She offered the girl a cup of water, but Scarlett simply stared at it, her eyes dull, as if the offer meant nothing to her in that moment. Ethel sat down across from her, her gaze soft but searching. She needed to approach this carefully. Scarlett was already scared, already vulnerable. Ethel didn't want to overwhelm her with too many questions all at once, but she needed answers. "Scarlett," Ethel began gently, "I need you to tell me what happened. You don't have to tell me everything right now, but anything you can tell me will help. Can you tell me about your mommy? About Lauren?" The little girl's eyes flickered to the cup of water in front of her, but she didn't touch it. Instead, she stared at the table, her small hands twisting in her lap. "She used to sing to me," Scarlett said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She would sing my favorite song, the one about the stars, the one that makes me feel safe." But then she stopped. Ethel nodded, her heart aching for the little girl. Then she stopped. It was such a simple phrase, but it spoke volumes. Ethel had seen the signs before, when a parent begins to pull away from their child, when affection turns cold and harsh. It was the beginning of something more sinister. But why? What had happened? What had caused Lauren to change? "I'm sure you miss that, don't you?" Ethel asked, her voice soft. Scarlett nodded slowly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She used to smile when she sang. I could feel her love, but now she doesn't smile anymore. Ethel's mind swirled. It was clear that Scarlett had been deeply affected by her mother's sudden emotional withdrawal. But there was something more. The way the girl spoke of her mother's words, that she was too much, the guilt that haunted her voice, it was more than just a parent's frustration with a child. This sounded like neglect. Emotional abandonment. Perhaps even something worse. "Can you tell me what happened the last time you saw her?" Ethel asked gently, her voice a whisper. Scarlett blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears. Her little face scrunched up, as though she were searching for the right words. She told me to go outside," Scarlett said slowly, her voice trembling. "She said I should play outside because she needed to talk to someone. And I waited. I waited, but she didn't come." Ethel's heart sank. The child had been told to wait outside, as though she were an afterthought, an inconvenience. And then she had been left alone, abandoned in the parking lot. But why? Ethel leaned forward, her brow furrowing in concern. Did she say where she was going? Or who she needed to talk to? Scarlett shook her head, her small voice quivering. "No, she just said to go. That she needed space, that I should be quiet. I was too much," she said. Ethel's chest tightened. Too much. The phrase echoed in her mind as the gravity of the situation hit her with full force. It wasn't just that Lauren had left her daughter alone. It was the emotional abuse, the quiet cruelty of telling a child they were too much to handle, too much to love. Ethel felt a wave of protective instinct rise up in her. She had seen families torn apart before, but something about this felt different. Scarlett's vulnerability, her confusion, it all pointed to a deeper issue than mere neglect. There was something toxic about the relationship between this mother and child, something that had been festering for a long time. And Ethel wasn't going to let Scarlett go back into that environment without understanding what was happening. "I'm so sorry, Scarlett," Ethel said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't deserve to be treated like that. No one should ever make you feel like you're too much. Do you understand me? You are not too much. You're not a burden. You're important, and I'm here to help you." Scarlett nodded slowly, her eyes wide and uncertain. She had been through so much in such a short time, and the words Ethel spoke were the first real comfort she had felt all day. Ethel's mind was racing as she considered the next steps. She couldn't let Scarlett return to that environment, not without understanding why Lauren had acted this way. Why had she made her daughter feel so unwanted? It wasn't just a case of a mother getting overwhelmed. Something deeper was going on. Something more troubling. I'm going to take care of you, Scarlett, Ethel said, her voice steady. We're going to figure this out, okay? But first, I need to ask you a few more things. And you can take your time, sweetheart. You don't have to talk if you're not ready. Scarlett looked up at her, her gaze filled with both trust and fear. She didn't speak at first, but after a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to go back, Scarlett said, her voice cracking. I don't want to go back to Mommy. Ethel's heart broke for the little girl. No child should ever have to feel that way. It was clear now that Scarlett needed more than just a safe place. She needed to be shielded from the emotional abuse she had endured, and Ethel was determined to make sure she got the protection she deserved. Don't worry, Scarlett, Ethel said softly, her voice unwavering. You're not going back there. I'll make sure of it. As the words left her mouth, Ethel knew there was a difficult road ahead. The truth, the painful reality, was just beginning to unfold. And whatever secrets lay buried beneath the surface, Ethel was determined to uncover them. A path of discovery. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights in the back office of Maple Grove Police Station seemed almost soothing to Ethel as she sat at the small table across from Scarlett. Yet beneath the calm atmosphere, Ethel could feel the pressure building in her chest. She hadn't expected this shift to take such a personal turn. She was used to handling difficult cases, but this one was different. It was raw, heartbreaking, and far more complicated than she'd ever anticipated. The weight of Scarlett's words still hung in the air. I don't want to go back. The little girl's voice had trembled with fear and resignation, and Ethel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one isolated incident. There were deeper layers to this story, layers of neglect, emotional manipulation, and possibly something even darker. But what exactly? And where was the line between duty and compassion? Ethel stood up, her mind racing. She had to act quickly. She couldn't let Scarlett return to a place where she felt unwanted, unloved. It was clear that this wasn't a simple case of neglect, there was more to it, and Ethel was going to get to the bottom of it. But the question was how? Before she could gather her thoughts, a soft knock on the door broke her focus. She looked up to see Officer Langford, a fellow officer, standing in the doorway with a concerned look on his face. Ethel hadn't had a chance to brief him on the situation yet. Everything okay, Davis? Langford asked, his voice low but tinged with concern. Ethel nodded, though she could feel the tension rising within her. Yeah, but we've got a serious situation here. I need to get a hold of CPS, Child Protective Services, immediately. This little girl can't go back to her mother's house. Not like this. Langford raised an eyebrow, his expression one of both surprise and understanding. What's going on? Ethel sighed heavily and motioned to Scarlett, who was still sitting at the table, her eyes downcast, staring into her lap. Her mother left her alone in a parking lot this afternoon. She told her she was too much and that she needed to go outside. This isn't just neglect, it's emotional abuse, Langford. I've got a gut feeling there's more going on here than what we see. Langford looked at Scarlett with a mix of sympathy and concern. I'll make the call to CPS for you, he said, before turning back to Ethel. But what's your next move? Are we bringing her mother in for questioning? Ethel paused for a moment, contemplating. Part of her wanted to rush in, confront Lauren, demand answers. But that wasn't the right approach. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. There was a child in front of her who needed answers too, and those answers would take time, patience, and the proper procedure. No, Ethel said firmly. Not yet. We need to figure out what's really going on here first. If Lauren's hurting her, we need to be sure, and we need evidence. I don't want to make things worse for Scarlett by dragging her mother in here until we know the full story. I'll start by speaking with some of the neighbors, see if anyone knows anything about the family. Maybe someone saw something, or maybe we can find a pattern. Langford nodded. Got it. I'll stay on the phone with CPS and get someone here to check on the situation. You do what you need to do. As Langford left the room to make the call, Ethel turned her attention back to Scarlett. The little girl still hadn't moved, her small body hunched in on itself, her gaze fixed on the floor as though she were trying to disappear. It broke Ethel's heart. "Scarlett," she said gently, her voice soft and soothing, "I know you're scared, but I'm going to help you, okay? You don't have to be afraid anymore. We're going to figure this out." The girl looked up slowly, her big eyes locking onto Ethel's. The vulnerability in those eyes was almost unbearable. For a brief moment, Scarlett opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a small sob escaped her lips, and her tiny shoulders trembled. Ethel's heart clenched. Without thinking, she stood up and moved to the side of the table, kneeling beside Scarlett. The little girl's body stiffened at first, as though she didn't know how to react to this sudden warmth, this compassion from a stranger. But then, slowly, she relaxed, and Ethel placed a hand gently on her back, offering comfort without saying another word. Scarlett's sobs became louder, and Ethel let her cry, her heart breaking with every tear that fell. The sound of a child in distress was one that never left you, it burrowed deep into your soul, urging you to do everything you could to make it stop, to make the hurt go away. After a long time, Scarlett's crying began to subside, and she pulled away slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Ethel gave her a soft smile, though it was tinged with sadness. This was a small moment of comfort, but there was so much more to do. "I know it's hard," Ethel said quietly, "but it's okay. You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." Scarlett nodded slowly, her small voice barely audible. "I just want my mommy to love me again." Ethel closed her eyes for a brief moment, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. This wasn't about a lack of love. This was something deeper, something that had eroded over time. And it was up to Ethel to uncover the truth, to protect this little girl from the damage that had already been done. "I know you want that, Scarlett. But right now, we need to make sure you're safe. And if your mommy can't give you that love, then we'll find someone who can. You deserve to feel loved, safe, and happy." Scarlett's eyes brightened a little, a flicker of hope sparking in them. Ethel could see the tiniest glimmer of trust beginning to form, and it filled her with a resolve she hadn't even realized she had. She would protect this child. No matter the cost. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Ethel looked up to see Langford standing in the doorway, his expression grave. "The CPS officer is on their way, but there's something you need to hear," he said quietly. "We pulled up some records on Lauren. It's not good, Ethel. There's a history of domestic disputes, and a neighbor mentioned that Lauren had been getting increasingly agitated recently. It sounds like this might not be the first time she's left Scarlett alone like this." Ethel felt her blood run cold. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was part of a pattern, a toxic cycle that had been happening for far too long. And now it was time to break it. "Thank you, Langford," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure Scarlett gets the help she needs. And if her mother is part of this, we'll make sure she can't hurt her anymore." As Langford nodded and left the room, Ethel turned back to Scarlett. The girl was looking at her with a mix of hope and fear, as if she knew things were about to change, but she wasn't sure how. Ethel reached out and took her hand. "We're going to be okay," she said, her voice firm and full of conviction. "And you're going to be okay, too. I promise." Unraveling the past. The office was silent again, save for the sound of Scarlett's quiet breaths as she leaned against Ethel, her small form tucked into the police officer's side for comfort. Ethel couldn't help but notice how fragile the little girl seemed, like a bird with broken wings, fragile, but yearning for the chance to fly again. Ethel wanted to believe that she could be the one to help her soar, but the weight of what lay ahead felt overwhelming. The CPS officer had just arrived, a woman in her late 30s named Detective Sarah Mitchell. She was a seasoned social worker with a reputation for being both compassionate and thorough. As she stepped into the room, she offered a warm, reassuring smile to both Ethel and Scarlett, though her eyes immediately softened when they fell on the girl. "Hey there, sweetie," Detective Mitchell said gently, kneeling down to Scarlett's level. "My name's Sarah, and I'm here to make sure you're okay." Scarlett looked up at her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Her face was still blotchy from crying, and her big eyes flickered between Ethel and the new officer, unsure of who to trust or what would come next. "It's okay," Sarah continued, her voice steady and calming. "I'm just here to help, and you can tell me anything, okay?" Scarlett didn't answer right away, but she nodded slowly, as if testing the waters before she could fully believe that this woman meant her no harm. It wasn't hard for Ethel to understand why the little girl was cautious. She had been abandoned by the one person who was supposed to love and protect her, and now she was surrounded by strangers who were trying to fill that void. Ethel's heart ached as she watched them. She wished there were a way to erase all the pain that this child had endured, but she knew better than anyone that healing would take time. She glanced over at Detective Mitchell, signaling that it was time to talk. "Can we step outside for a minute?" Ethel asked quietly, not wanting to disturb Scarlett's fragile state. Sarah nodded in agreement, rising to her feet as Ethel motioned for her to follow. They both stepped out into the quiet hallway, where they could speak more freely without disturbing the young girl. Once they were out of earshot, Ethel wasted no time in filling Sarah in on what she knew so far. "I don't know much, but what I've gathered is this: Scarlett's mother, Lauren, is emotionally distant, maybe even abusive. She told Scarlett that she was too much and that she should go outside because Lauren needed space. I'm afraid this isn't an isolated incident. I have a bad feeling this is part of a much larger issue." Sarah listened intently, her face growing more serious with each passing word. "It's a red flag. Leaving a 4-year-old alone in a parking lot, abandonment isn't just a one-off. It's the culmination of something much deeper. Emotional neglect, verbal abuse. It's all part of a pattern, and it's very likely that this little girl has been exposed to this kind of behavior for much longer than today." Ethel nodded, her mind spinning with the implications of Sarah's words. She knew that there was more to this than just Scarlett's immediate trauma. The little girl's pain was rooted in something far older, something that could be traced back years to Lauren's own struggles, or lack of them. And the thought of what might have been happening behind closed doors made Ethel's stomach twist. "I've requested a full investigation, but I think we need to move fast," Ethel continued. "I want to talk to the neighbors, see if anyone can shed some light on what's been happening at the house. And I want to check Lauren's records. We need to know if this is the first time CPS has been involved." "Agreed," Sarah said, her voice calm but resolute. "I'll start pulling her case file. But I'll also be contacting our team to set up an immediate welfare check on Scarlett. If there's any sign of ongoing emotional abuse or neglect, we'll need to take further steps to protect her. This little girl needs more than just a temporary safe place. She needs a long-term solution." Ethel felt a rush of gratitude toward Sarah. She had worked with CPS before, but seeing how thoroughly Sarah was approaching the situation reassured her. She was in good hands, and Scarlett was, too. "I'll get started on the neighbor interviews," Ethel said. "We'll find out the truth, no matter how buried it is." As the two women parted ways to handle their respective duties, Ethel couldn't help but reflect on what had brought her here. She'd been a police officer for over 2 decades, and she had seen a lot in that time: violent crimes, domestic disputes, even a few tragic cases involving children. But nothing had ever struck her quite like this. This wasn't just a case to her, this was personal. The memories of her own son, Michael, and the years she had spent with her late husband, JN, flooded her thoughts once more. She had been blessed with a family that loved her, and the idea that any child could be deprived of that love was almost unbearable. She had been given the gift of motherhood, and she had poured her heart and soul into raising her son. To think of a child like Scarlett being deprived of that love, that security, it tore at her in a way that words couldn't explain. Ethel made her way to the parking lot, where her patrol car was parked, and got in. She took a deep breath before starting the engine. The next steps were crucial, and they had to be carried out with the utmost care. She drove to a quiet suburban street just a few blocks away from the police station, where Scarlett and Lauren lived. The houses were modest, neat, and lined up with the kind of picturesque order that one might expect from a neighborhood like Maple Grove. The scene looked peaceful, but Ethel knew appearances could be deceiving. As she parked the car and stepped out, she felt a sense of determination wash over her. She wasn't just here to follow a procedure. She was here to save a life, Scarlett's life. The first house on the block was a beige two-story with a neatly trimmed lawn and a small front porch. It looked like any other home in the neighborhood, yet Ethel knew better than to make assumptions based on appearances. She knocked on the door, her heart beating a little faster as she waited for someone to answer. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 40s with graying hair and tired eyes. She looked like she had been through her fair share of hardship, but there was a quiet strength about her. She regarded Ethel warily. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice low. "I'm Officer Ethel Davis," Ethel said, offering a gentle but firm smile. "I'm here to ask you a few questions about your neighbor, Lauren Winters." The woman's eyes flickered with recognition. "Lauren? What's this about?" Ethel hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It's about her daughter, Scarlett. Something happened today, and I need to know if you've noticed anything unusual going on at their house. Any problems, perhaps?" The woman frowned, looking away for a moment before meeting Ethel's gaze again. "I don't want to cause any trouble," she said softly. "But I've seen things. I've seen Lauren shut herself away from her daughter. I've seen Scarlett crying at the window, and I've heard shouting. I thought it was just my imagination at first, but now, well, I don't think I can ignore it anymore." Ethel's pulse quickened. "What kind of shouting? And how often?" The woman hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I don't know if you'll believe me, but it's been happening for months. Little things at first, slamming doors, yelling about things that don't seem important. And then one day, I heard Lauren tell Scarlett to shut up, just like that. I thought it was a one-time thing, but it's been happening more often. That poor little girl. I'm sorry, officer. I should have said something sooner." Ethel nodded gravely, her heart sinking. It wasn't just Lauren's emotional neglect, it was more. It was a pattern of cruelty, and it had been going on for far too long. "Thank you for telling me this," Ethel said softly. "You've done the right thing. And we're going to make sure Scarlett is safe." As she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much darker truth. Lauren's behavior had been a cry for help, but it had also been a deep wound, a wound that had festered too long. And now, it was time to heal. The hidden truths. The sun had begun to set by the time Ethel left the woman's house on Maple Street. The sky above was awash in deep oranges and purples, and the air was cooler now, a stark contrast to the warmth that had enveloped the afternoon. Yet, as Ethel walked toward her car, her heart felt heavier than ever. The neighbor's words had confirmed what she had already feared: Scarlett's life had been filled with far more darkness than any child should endure. The emotional wounds were deep, and they had been left unchecked for too long. Ethel's mind raced as she drove back to the station, processing everything she had learned in the last few hours. Scarlett's mother, Lauren, was caught in a vicious cycle of neglect and emotional detachment. The disturbing events at the Winters house were a part of a larger pattern of behavior, and Ethel had to piece it all together before the full weight of the situation became clear. Once inside the station, Ethel found Detective Sarah Mitchell at her desk, surrounded by papers. Sarah's brow was furrowed in concentration as she flipped through Scarlett's case file. When she saw Ethel approaching, she set the papers down and motioned for her to sit. "Any new developments?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. Ethel sat down across from her, her body language betraying the exhaustion she felt. "I spoke to a neighbor. She confirmed what we suspected. Lauren's been emotionally neglecting Scarlett for months. There's more shouting than I thought, and the little girl has been left alone more times than we know." Sarah's expression darkened. "This is worse than I imagined. I've gone through the case history, and it's clear Lauren's been in and out of therapy for the last couple of years. It's not enough for her to have gotten the help she needs. The truth is, Lauren's been struggling with her own demons, probably since before Scarlett was born. But no one's been there to intervene. The system failed Scarlett before she even knew what was happening." Ethel shook her head, unable to suppress the knot that had formed in her throat. "How did we miss this? How did no one see what was going on?" Sarah's eyes softened. "Sometimes, we see what we want to see. Lauren has kept up appearances, and the system only steps in when things reach a breaking point. We're not equipped to catch the warning signs until it's too late. But now we know, Ethel. And we're not going to let Scarlett suffer anymore." Ethel took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had always believed that she could handle any case that came her way, but this one felt different. The weight of it was pressing down on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The face of every child she'd ever served flashed in her mind's eye, and for the first time in years, she wondered whether she was doing enough for the children of Maple Grove. Sarah seemed to sense the shift in Ethel's mood, and she reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder in a rare moment of comfort. "You're doing everything you can. We're doing everything we can. But we can't fix everything on our own, Ethel. Sometimes, we just have to take it one step at a time." Ethel nodded, though the doubt still lingered. She had seen too many broken families, too many lives marred by the actions of those who were supposed to protect. But something about this case was different. Scarlett was not just a victim, she was a survivor. And Ethel was going to make sure she had the chance to live a life free from fear. Later that evening, Ethel and Sarah met with their colleagues to go over the next steps. The investigation into Lauren Winter's past had uncovered several disturbing details, including a history of volatile relationships, brief stints in and out of rehab, and claims of severe emotional instability. But the most shocking revelation came from a former neighbor who had witnessed physical altercations between Lauren and an unnamed partner. Lauren's pattern of behavior is consistent with someone struggling with deep emotional issues that she never addressed properly, Sarah explained to the group. "We need to act quickly to ensure Scarlett's safety, and that includes reaching out to family members. We need to build a clearer picture of what's been happening in the Winters household." Ethel nodded. "I'll reach out to Lauren's sister. She's the only family member listed as a contact in Scarlett's medical records. Maybe she's seen something that could help us understand more about what's been going on." As the team discussed further actions, Ethel's thoughts wandered back to Scarlett, who was now in protective custody at the station. The little girl had been through so much, yet she had managed to remain resilient in the face of it all. Ethel knew that while they couldn't undo the harm that had been done, they could start the healing process. And that healing would have to begin with giving Scarlett the stability and security she had been denied for so long. The following morning, Ethel arrived at the station early, her mind still weighed down by the complexities of the case. She had spoken briefly with Scarlett before leaving the previous evening, but the little girl had retreated into herself again, closing off the world around her as if she were trying to protect herself from further harm. Ethel walked into the small room where Scarlett was sitting, her back turned, gazing out the window at the cars parked in the lot outside. The room was quiet, save for the sound of the ticking clock on the wall and the occasional murmur of voices from the hallway. "Scarlett?" Ethel said softly, her voice gentle but firm. Scarlett turned slowly, her face pale and drawn. There was something different about her today, a look of quiet sadness that made Ethel's heart ache. She had seen this look before, on children who had witnessed too much in too little time. "I'm sorry," Scarlett whispered, her voice small and hesitant. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Ethel crouched down beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't cause any trouble, Scarlett. You're safe here. And you didn't do anything wrong. Your mom, she didn't know how to take care of you, but that's not your fault. Do you understand?" Scarlett nodded, though her eyes were clouded with confusion. The little girl had been told so many conflicting things by her mother that it was hard for her to grasp the reality of her situation. She had been made to feel like she was the problem when, in fact, it was her mother who needed help. "I'm scared," Scarlett admitted quietly. "I don't want to go back there. I don't want to go back to my mommy." Ethel's chest tightened at the raw honesty in Scarlett's words. The little girl wasn't just afraid of the environment she had been living in, she was afraid of the one person who was supposed to offer her unconditional love. "You don't have to go back there, Scarlett," Ethel said, her voice full of conviction. "Not unless it's safe for you. We're going to make sure that you're protected." Scarlett's eyes met hers, a flicker of hope stirring within them. Ethel could see the smallest crack in the wall that Scarlett had built around herself, and she knew it was a sign that the child was beginning to trust again. But it wasn't enough just to protect her physically. The emotional healing would take much longer, and Ethel was ready to be there for her every step of the way. Just as Ethel was about to say more, the door opened, and Detective Sarah Mitchell stepped inside. Her face was grim, but there was a determined glint in her eyes. "We've got news," Sarah said, her voice tight. "We've reached out to Lauren's sister. She has agreed to take Scarlett in, temporarily, at least. But it's not a permanent solution. The investigation into Lauren's past has revealed a lot of things that we can't ignore. We'll be pressing charges, Ethel. This is bigger than we thought." Ethel's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she wasn't sure how to react. But as she looked down at Scarlett, who was watching her with wide, hopeful eyes, the answer became clear. They couldn't let this go any longer. "We're going to make sure she's okay," Ethel said firmly. "And we're going to make sure that her mom can never hurt her again." A new beginning. The days following the revelations about Lauren's emotional neglect were a blur of legal procedures, phone calls, and paperwork. But amidst the chaos, a small sense of clarity began to settle over Ethel. She had always believed that the truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how buried it seemed, and now, she was watching that very truth unfold. Yet, even with the case moving forward, the real work was just beginning. Scarlett needed a new beginning. A fresh start far removed from the toxic environment that had shaped her early years. After the meeting with Lauren's sister, the decision was made. Scarlett would temporarily be placed with her aunt, a woman named Carla Winters. Carla was a soft-spoken, nurturing woman in her early 40s, who had been living out of state for several years. She had no idea about the extent of what had been going on in Lauren's home until Ethel reached out, and despite her own busy life, Carla had agreed to come to Maple Grove and take Scarlett in. Ethel had been cautiously optimistic about this development, but she knew it was just a temporary solution. As much as Carla seemed like the safe harbor Scarlett desperately needed, there was no guarantee that the system would allow such an arrangement to remain permanent without the necessary legal steps. But for now, Scarlett was safe. Ethel drove to Carla's home early one morning, her mind heavy with the thoughts of what the little girl had been through. It had been a long journey for Ethel to come to terms with the emotional toll this case had taken on her, but the reality of Scarlett's situation hit home every time she saw the girl's haunted eyes. She was determined to help in any way she could. Carla's house was a modest, two-story home on the edge of town. It was a welcoming place, with a well-kept garden and a white picket fence that seemed to signal safety, warmth, and stability. As Ethel pulled up, she could already see Carla standing on the porch, her arms crossed tightly against the cool morning air. She looked worried but relieved, the expression on her face a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Carla had spoken with Ethel the day before, and Ethel could tell that the woman was trying to manage the weight of what had just been thrust upon her. Raising her niece after years of being apart wasn't going to be easy, but Carla was determined to do it right. Ethel stepped out of her car and walked up to the porch, giving Carla a warm, reassuring smile. "You ready?" Ethel asked, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Carla nodded, but the emotion behind her eyes was clear. "I've never been ready for this. But I'll do whatever it takes to give Scarlett the life she deserves." Her voice cracked slightly, and she quickly wiped away a tear. "I don't know why Lauren never let me in. I wish I had known what was going on." Ethel could understand the guilt Carla felt, but she knew there was no time for regrets now. They had to focus on the present. "You're here now. That's what matters. Scarlett will need you more than ever." They both turned as the front door opened, and Scarlett stepped out, holding her favorite stuffed animal tightly to her chest. The little girl's face was still pale, and her eyes seemed distant, as though she were uncertain of everything around her. But when she saw Carla, a flicker of recognition passed through her, and she hesitantly walked toward the woman who was now her guardian. "Scarlett," Carla said softly, kneeling down to the girl's level. "Sweetheart, I'm your Aunt Carla. I'm so glad you're here. I've heard so many wonderful things about you." Scarlett took a cautious step forward, her eyes searching Carla's face as though trying to decide if this was a safe place. After a long moment of silence, she finally nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi, Aunt Carla." The two embraced briefly, and Ethel watched with a bittersweet smile. She knew the bond between them wouldn't be immediate, but it was a start. It was the beginning of something that could eventually heal the scars that had been left on Scarlett's soul. After a quiet breakfast, during which Ethel noticed that Scarlett ate little but seemed to find comfort in the steady presence of her aunt, they began to talk. Carla had made a promise to Ethel that she would give Scarlett space, but she would also keep her heart open to the possibility of building trust with the little girl. As they sat together in the cozy living room, Carla gently explained that they would be spending time getting to know each other, step by step. Ethel observed the interaction from a distance, her heart full of hope for what the future could hold. That afternoon, as Carla played with Scarlett in the backyard, Ethel took the opportunity to meet with Sarah and the rest of the team to go over the next steps of the investigation. They gathered in the small, windowless meeting room at the police station, and Ethel could feel the weight of the case pressing down on her once more. "Lauren's out of town for the time being," Sarah said, her voice calm yet full of resolve. "We've confirmed that she was staying with a friend in another town after leaving Scarlett. From what we know, she's not expected to return to Maple Grove anytime soon. But that doesn't mean we're letting our guard down. There's still the matter of legal custody and pressing charges." Ethel nodded. "I'm ready to go full throttle with the charges. This woman has been emotionally abusing her child for far too long. But I also don't want to rush the process, not when Scarlett's still adjusting to her new life. I want her to have time to breathe before things get any more complicated for her." Sarah's gaze softened. "You're right. We don't want to overwhelm her, but we can't let this go on either. We need to push for a hearing that will determine permanent custody for Carla. Scarlett's future is at stake, and we need to make sure she's protected." Ethel's fingers gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white with the tension she felt. She had never been one to back down, but the thought of putting Scarlett through yet another upheaval made her heart ache. This little girl had been through too much already. "We'll do it right," Ethel said quietly, her voice firm. "We'll give Scarlett everything she needs, no matter what it takes. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of legal proceedings, social worker visits, and meetings between Carla and the family lawyer. But through it all, one thing was clear: Scarlett was beginning to heal. Slowly but surely, the little girl began to trust her aunt. She started sleeping better, eating more, and even smiling again. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Ethel to see the progress. It was the kind of progress that didn't happen overnight but was forged through patience and love. And as the days turned into weeks, Ethel knew she had made the right choice. She had done what she could to protect this child, to help her find a way out of the darkness that had once defined her life. But now, it was up to Carla, the steady presence of an aunt who loved her unconditionally, to offer her the chance to live a full, happy life.